Let us take a slow and gentle journey back to 19th century London. The city was crowded, noisy and restless, with fog that clung to the streets and horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestones. It was an age of progress, an age of empire, and yet also a time of poverty, struggle and hidden sufferings. Among these, there was one quiet, creeping force that worked its way into homes, parlours, psych rooms and markets. It was not war, nor politics, nor even the industrial smoke that blackened the skies. It was a substance, powdered, bottled and swallowed in spoonfuls, that would shape countless lives, especially the lives of women. This was the age when opium, in its many forms, became both a comfort and a curse. The story begins not in the grand halls of Parliament, but in the smaller, dimly lit rooms of ordinary households. In the 19th century, medicine was still a world of guesswork. Doctors did not have antibiotics, nor modern painkillers, nor the safety nets of regulated pharmacies. Instead, they had powders and tinctures, often sold over the counter by chemists or even by grocers, and among these the most trusted and most widely used was laudanum. Laudanum was a mixture of opium dissolved in alcohol. It was a dark, bitter liquid stored in little bottles, sometimes carefully labelled, sometimes not. It was used for sleeplessness, for coughs, for fevers, for women's pains, for children's teething. In truth, it was used for almost anything that troubled the body or mind. A spoonful promised calm, another spoonful promised deeper rest, and yet another for some promised escape. Women in Victorian London often turned to it not out of indulgence, but out of necessity. The demands placed upon them were heavy. Many were wives and mothers, charged with raising children in cramped homes where illness could sweep through a household in days. Some were working women, labouring in factories, sewing rooms, or as servants, with little pay and long hours. The hardships of childbirth, the dangers of infection, the endless wear of anxiety, these were daily realities, and in the midst of them there was laudanum, resting quietly in a cupboard, available at nearly any time. The chemist shops of London sold it freely. Rows of glass bottles lined their shelves, some containing bright syrups for coughs, others filled with mysterious powders. There was little distinction between medicine and poison in those days. The same substance could serve as both. A penny or two might purchase enough laudanum to keep a family calm through the worst of nights. It was not hidden, nor forbidden, nor even stigmatized at first. Rather, it was ordinary, a part of daily life, as common as bread and tea. Yet the effect it had upon women was profound. Consider the lonely mother, warmed by the cries of a sick child. With no doctor nearby and little money to spare, she would reach for the brown bottle. A spoonful given to the infant might bring hours of quiet. A spoonful taken herself might bring a reprieve from pain or from the restless turning of the mind. In this way, opium became not only a medicine, but a companion. Still, it was not only the poor who relied upon it. In drawing rooms and parlours of the middle classes, women too found themselves reaching for the little bottle. Though they had more comfort than those in tenements, they also bore the weight of expectations, of appearance, of composure, of silence. Doctors, when consulted, often prescribed laudanum for ailments described in vague terms, nervous disorders, hysteria, female troubles. A lady might be told to take a dose before bed to calm her restless thoughts or to ease her monthly pains. The advice was given in good faith, but the result was the same. Dependency grew quietly, softly, unremarked. There was another form of opium that made its way into homes, Godfrey's cordial. This syrup, sweetened and flavoured, was sold especially for children. It was a solution to the cries of infants, to the fretfulness of toddlers. Working mothers, unable to stay at home, could give a dose of the cordial before leaving for long hours of labour, ensuring that their child would sleep safely, or so they believed. But beneath the sweetness was the same dark substance, the same powerful opiate, soothing not only the child but also stealing its strength. Many little lives were weakened by it, some even lost, and yet it was considered normal. The city itself offered few alternatives. London was a place of filth and disease. Water supplies were tainted. Sanitation was poor. Cholera and typhus lurked in crowded districts. Doctors might prescribe rest, but rest was a luxury few could afford. They might prescribe change of air, but such remedies belonged only to the wealthy. And so for both rich and poor, opium was the simplest, cheapest, and most certain relief. As the decades passed, the use of laudanum and other opiates grew ever more widespread. Women wrote of it in their diaries, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with sorrow. Some spoke of the comfort it gave, others of the prison it became. For while the bottle promised ease, it also bound its users with invisible chains. Tolerance grew, more was needed. And then came the struggle of trying to stop, only to be met with sleepless nights, trembling hands, and unrelenting despair. Writers of the age began to notice. Poets and novelists hinted at the hidden cost of the little brown bottle. Famous names, such as Thomas de Quincey, confessed their own entanglement, describing both the strange dreams and the haunting dependence. Yet for every celebrated writer who spoke openly, there were countless women who bore their struggles in silence, hidden behind the polite curtains of Victorian homes. It is important to remember that these women did not seek vice. They sought relief. They sought rest from the burdens of a world that demanded much and offered little comfort in return. Their use of opium was not the wild indulgence of dens or smoky halls, but the quiet act of mothers and wives, of workers and widows, turning to the one remedy that seemed always at hand. By the later years of the century, reformers began to raise their voices. The dangers of overuse were becoming undeniable. Reports surfaced of children weakened by cordials, of women wasting away from dependence. Doctors too began to warn more cautiously, though still without the modern understanding of addiction. Gradually regulations appeared. The sale of opium became more restricted. Labels carried warnings. Yet even then, the habit did not vanish. It lingered, for habits so deeply rooted cannot be easily pulled up. If we pause here, in the midst of London's fog, we can almost picture the quiet scenes that played out again and again. A mother sitting by the fire, weary from tending her children, measuring a spoonful of laudanum. A lady in a respectable neighbourhood, writing letters late into the night, her bottle close at hand. A servant girl, coughing from the damp air, taking a small dose before returning to her work, each of them finding, for a time, a measure of peace in the dark liquid. And yet beneath that peace there was a shadow, the shadow of reliance, of dependence, of silent suffering. It was a hidden epidemic, not shouted in the streets, but whispered in parlours and kitchens. Its victims were not soldiers on battlefields, but women in their homes. The story of opium in 19th century London is not one of sudden drama, but of slow unfolding. It is a story of ordinary lives touched by an extraordinary substance. It is a reminder of how, in an age before modern medicine, people reached for what they could, often without knowing the cost. And so we leave them there, in their quiet rooms, their bottles on the shelf, their struggles unseen. We leave them not with judgment, but with understanding. For they lived in a world that offered few choices, and in that world, opium was both comfort and chain. London, in the later years of the 19th century, was a city of contrasts. The wealth of empire flowed into its docks, filling warehouses with goods from every corner of the globe. The railways carried travellers across the land, the telegraph wires carried messages faster than ever before, and the streets themselves bustled with life. Yet beneath the noise and movement there was another rhythm, slower and quieter, that shaped the lives of many within the city. It was the rhythm of bottles being opened, of spoons being lifted, of laudanum poured carefully into cups of water. The presence of opium in women's lives was by now so ordinary that it seemed unremarkable. In countless homes, whether large or small, there rested at least one brown bottle. Some were kept in cupboards, some in bedside tables, others upon mantels or in kitchen drawers. The bottles came from chemists, from grocers, sometimes even from travelling sellers who carried remedies in little cases. They were labelled with instructions that few followed carefully, for the liquid was already trusted, already familiar. For the women of the city, these bottles became companions. In households where illness was common, laudanum was the first answer. A child coughing through the night would be soothed with a few drops. A mother worn by sleeplessness would take her own measure. An elderly woman bent with pain would sip slowly, letting the warmth spread through her frame. In every case, the substance promised ease, and in most cases it delivered, at least for a time. Life in London was seldom easy. The poor struggled with hunger and damp lodgings, the middle classes with anxieties and expectations, the wealthy with the hidden pressures of society. Women in particular bore the weight of health without help, for medical knowledge was limited, and doctors often prescribed little more than rest, tonics, or the very laudanum already at hand. A woman suffering a nervous exhaustion was told to take a dose. A woman enduring a female complaint was told to take a dose. A woman grieving, sleepless or restless was told the same. And so the cycle continued. The city itself seemed arranged around this quiet dependence. Chemist shops glowed with lamplight in the evenings, their shelves lined with glass bottles of every size. Behind the counters, clerks measured powders, filled bottles, and wrapped parcels, their hands moving quickly, their expressions calm. Few asked questions, for the trade was brisk and the demand unending. In poorer districts, smaller shops offered cordials for infants, mixtures sweetened to mask the bitterness, yet carrying the same substance within. Mothers purchased them without hesitation, for they allowed children to rest while the work of survival carried on. As the years passed, the effects of these habits became more visible. Women who had long relied upon laudanum began to notice their strength fading. Some found themselves unable to sleep without it, their nights restless unless the familiar warmth settled in their veins. Others felt their appetites diminish, their limbs weaken, their minds cloud with strange fancies. Yet even as such signs appeared, the thought of stopping seemed impossible. For without the bottle, the pain returned, the sleeplessness deepened, the nerves frayed. In this way, dependence became as binding as iron, though it was invisible and seldom spoken of. The homes of London carried these quiet struggles in silence. In small rooms above factories, in kitchens beneath grand houses, in parlours draped with lace, women measured their doses and carried on. Few confessed their reliance openly. It was not a subject for polite conversation, nor one easily admitted even within families. And so the epidemic spread not by loud proclamation, but by the steady private turning of spoons in cups, the steady private comfort of doses taken night after night. Writers and observers of the time began to notice. A few spoke of the dangers, describing women who seemed always tired, always pale, always carrying the faint odour of medicine. Others wrote of children weakened by soothing syrups, their little lives dimmed by the very cordial meant to calm them. But these accounts were scattered, and the greater public often paid them little mind, for the bottles were still trusted, still part of the ordinary rhythm of life. It is important to remember that the women who used opium in these ways were not seeking pleasure. They were not chasing wild visions, nor trying to escape into dream worlds. Most of them sought only rest. Rest from pain, rest from worry, rest from the endless demands of their households. In a city where labour was long and resources few, rest itself was a luxury. And so laudanum became the answer, the one thing that seemed always available, always certain. Even among the wealthy, whose homes were spacious and comfortable, the same pattern held. Ladies who smiled at dinners, who walked in gardens, who read poetry by lamplight, often retired to their chambers with bottles upon their tables. Their physicians encouraged them, believing the medicine harmless if taken with care. Yet in time, these women too felt the same weakening, the same quiet chains of dependence. They masked it with powder upon their faces, with graceful words in conversation, but the truth lingered beneath. By the later decades, reformers began to raise their voices more clearly. They warned of the dangers, they called for regulation, they spoke of lives diminished by the quiet epidemic. Newspapers published stories, doctors debated in journals, and lawmakers considered restrictions. Gradually, changes came. Labels were made more precise, sales more carefully controlled. Yet even then, The bottles remained in homes, for habits formed over decades cannot be undone by words alone. The image of London in this time is therefore not only one of smoke and industry, of railways and carriages, but also of countless small rooms, each with its own bottle, each with its own story. A mother soothing her child, a wife calming her nerves, an elder easing her pain, each believing in the moment that she was doing what was necessary, what was best. And in many ways she was, for the choices available were few, and the world offered little comfort otherwise. The story of the epidemic is not a tale of villains and victims, but of ordinary lives caught in the current of history. It is the story of a city seeking rest and of women bearing the weight of that search. The bottles upon the shelves were symbols not only of medicine, but of the burdens carried, the silences kept, the endurance required. And so, as we walk slowly through the streets of Victorian London in our imagination, we see the lamps glowing in the fog, the shop doors closing at night, the figures hurrying home. We know that behind many of those doors, in rooms large and small, the quiet ritual continues. A spoon lifted, a drop measured, a sigh of relief as the world softens for a little while. This was the heart of the epidemic. Not loud, not public, but hidden, private, woven into the fabric of daily life. And in understanding it, we glimpse not only the history of a substance, but the history of the women whose lives were shaped by it. London continued to breathe under its heavy skies. The fog that drifted through the streets was no longer a novelty, nor a surprise. It was the ordinary mask of the city, a veil drawn across alleys, bridges, and markets. Beneath that veil, life carried on in its quiet rhythms, shops opening in the morning, carts rattling along cobblestones, children running with laughter, and women moving through their endless duties. Yet in many homes, behind shutters and curtains, another rhythm was at work. The rhythm of bottles opened, of drops counted, of laudanum poured into cups. The city had lived with this rhythm for so long that it had become part of its heartbeat. Few questioned. Few wondered what it meant that so many women relied upon a single substance to soothe their nights and ease their burdens. For them it was not strange. It was simply life as it had always been. But slowly, softly, whispers began to rise. Some doctors noticed patterns in their patients, women who returned again and again, asking for larger doses, unable to sleep without them. Some midwives observed children who grew weaker, their cries silenced but their strength fading. A few journalists wandering through the poorer quarters wrote of mothers who gave soothing cordials to infants, not out of cruelty but of desperation, and of children who did not grow as they should. These whispers did not yet form a storm. They were scattered, uncertain, sometimes dismissed. Yet they were the first signs that the city was beginning to see itself. For women, however, life went on much as before. In cramped tenements, the cordial was still poured into spoons for restless children, allowing weary mothers to sleep a few hours before rising again to work. In respectable parlours, the brown bottle still rested by the bedside, a quiet companion in the long hours of night. In grander houses, where society demanded constant composure, ladies still reached for their doses, sometimes before a dinner, sometimes after, sometimes both, sometimes both. The city's women carried on, each with her bottle, each with her need, each convinced she was alone in her struggle. Dependence was rarely spoken of. The word itself was scarcely formed. To many, the idea that a medicine could be both necessary and harmful at once was confusing. If a doctor gave it, if a chemist sold it, if it was available on every shelf, then surely it must be safe. And so women reproached themselves quietly for their weakness, rather than questioning the medicine itself. They whispered their confessions into diaries, or not at all. The quiet epidemic spread in silence, but the evidence was mounting. Doctors noticed that women who had relied on laudanum for years often appeared pale, thin, and exhausted, even when their original illness had long since faded. Families noticed that children given cordials were often frail, their vitality dimmed. But in the rhythm of survival, these signs were easy to ignore. The city itself encouraged the habit. Chemist shops glowed at night, their shelves filled with bottles, their clerks busy measuring and selling. The transactions were quick, the demand steady, the profits reliable. No one wished to turn away business, and no law demanded that they should. And so the trade continued, each bottle passing quietly from counter to hand, from hand to home. Yet as the century moved on, the whispers grew louder. Medical journals began to publish articles questioning the safety of unrestricted opium. Reformers spoke of children harmed by cordials, of women wasting away in secret. The language of addiction was still new, still uncertain, but it was beginning to take shape. For the first time, people began to speak not only of the relief laudanum gave, but also of the chains it formed. The women at the heart of this epidemic, however, seldom heard these debates. Their lives were too filled with immediate cares, children to feed, households to maintain, appearances to keep. They did not see themselves as part of a larger story. They were simply mothers soothing their children, wives calming their nerves, elders. The city of London in the middle of the 19th century seemed to rest beneath a veil that was not only of fog, soot, and gaslight, but also of something softer, less visible, and far more insidious. Behind closed doors in homes both splendid and humble, bottles of dark tincture rested upon mantels, tucked into cupboards, or hidden carefully in bedside drawers. They were small, unremarkable, and yet they carried within them the weight of an empire's habit. The drops of opium that had seeped into daily life with such quiet persistence that few stopped to question their presence. For women in particular, these bottles became both companions and confessions. A few drops into a glass of water could ease the sharpness of a headache, quiet the gnawing ache of grief, or soften the edges of loneliness in a long and silent night. In the soft flicker of a candle flame, a woman's hand might tremble ever so slightly as she reached for the familiar vial, a motion rehearsed so often that it became as natural as winding the clock before bed. London was vast and restless, yet it carried within it countless small chambers of privacy where such rituals unfolded unnoticed. In a tenement room where a seamstress bent for endless hours over her work, the bottle provided a rare gentleness at the end of her day. In a drawing room where a lady of fashion arranged her hair and prepared for another social evening, it steadied her nerves and carried her with composure into the glittering hall. The substance moved silently across boundaries of class and circumstance. What united these women was not their station, but the quiet reliance upon a liquid that seemed to promise solace when the world asked for more than they could give. The epidemic of opium in Victorian London was rarely spoken of in those very terms. The newspapers, when they touched upon it at all, framed it as a matter of medical need, of delicate constitutions, of female frailty soothed by modern remedies. Doctors wrote prescriptions freely. Apothecaries sold tinctures without hesitation, and chemists displayed them as openly as they did any other bottle. Respectability cloaked the practice. To speak of opium as indulgence or as habit or as dependency was to risk unsettling the carefully maintained surface of society, and so it was not spoken of, not in public, and not in any tone that suggested reproach. Women carried the greatest share of this silence. To confess struggle was to invite judgment, and judgment weighed heavily in a world where reputations were as fragile as porcelain. Instead, women learned to fold their reliance upon opium into the fabric of daily life, weaving it quietly among their duties and appearances. A housewife who woke before dawn to manage her household might take a measured dose before beginning her work, convincing herself it was no more unusual than tea. A governess pressed by solitude in the attic of a fine house might calm her restlessness with laudanum before setting her pen to paper to write a dutiful letter home. An actress dazzling beneath the gaslights of the stage might slip a drop before stepping into her costume, steadying the nerves that no audience ever saw. The city around them moved as though unaware, though in truth the evidence was everywhere for those willing to notice. Chemist shops thrived in every district, their shelves heavy with ornate bottles, their counters lined with customers who seldom asked questions. Advertisements appeared in the backs of magazines, promising soothing cordials for women and children alike. Mothers gave infants sweetened mixtures to quiet their cries, never pausing to wonder whether silence gained so easily carried its own dangers. The bitter taste of opium was hidden beneath syrup, and so it slipped as easily into the lives of children as it did their mothers. Even the grand avenues of the West End, with their tall houses and polished carriages, bore the mark of the epidemic. Behind lace curtains, ladies retired from dinners or balls with headaches that only the familiar tincture could soothe. In letters preserved from the time, one may find hints of sleeplessness cured, of nerves steadied, of pain dulled by a my usual remedy. The words are vague, but their meaning is clear enough. To speak plainly of opium was to draw too close to something society preferred to imagine as passing and controlled. Yet the reliance deepened night after night until for many women it was no longer a question of comfort but of necessity. The rhythm of the city seemed almost to echo this hidden dependence. London thrummed with energy. The factories, the markets, the theatres, the endless sound of horses upon cobblestones. And within that relentless beat, opium provided the illusion of pause, of softness. It was as though the city itself required some counterbalance to its pace, and in countless private moments, that balance was found in the small glass bottles that glimmered in candlelight. And yet, beneath the calm surface, there lingered shadows. Some women grew pale, their health quietly failing, though no one spoke of cause. Some grew withdrawn, their thoughts dulled by constant dosing. Some clutched at the bottle with hands that shook not from nerves, but from the body's growing insistence upon what it had come to expect. Families whispered explanations that did not quite align, speaking of weak constitutions or delicate nerves. Respectability demanded such phrases, but behind them lay the truth of a city slowly numbed by its own medicine. It was not a dramatic epidemic, not the sort that filled hospitals or emptied streets. Instead, it was a quiet one, measured out drop by drop, hidden in the folds of routine. There were no banners raised against it, no speeches delivered in Parliament naming it as danger. It was too polite, too domesticated, too ordinary for that. And yet for the women who lived within its embrace, it shaped daily existence as surely as the fog shaped the London air. In this chapter of history, one must imagine not the loud tumult of crisis, but the hushed continuity of reliance. Imagine a city where, in house after house, women reached for the same familiar remedy, believing it both harmless and necessary. Imagine how many evenings ended with the bittersweet taste of tincture upon the tongue. How many mornings began with the faint relief it promised. It is in that repetition, quiet and unseen, that the true scale of the epidemic emerges. London once again lay beneath a blanket of mist, its long streets muffled by fog that curled around iron railings, blurred gas lamps into dull globes, and softened the edges of the city until all seemed caught between waking and dreaming. To wander through those quiet hours of the night was to move through a city of shadows, and in those shadows, habits were nurtured, rituals were formed, and secrets were kept. Among these secrets was the growing reliance upon a substance that slipped into every corner of Victorian life, unspoken yet ever present, and particularly entwined with the lives of women. In drawing rooms, in tenements, in narrow attics and spacious parlours alike, bottles of laudanum sat quietly, almost invisibly, part of the background of life. They stood in cabinets beside respectable medicines, or hid in baskets beside sewing kits. Their presence did not alarm anyone, for opium in its various forms was so ordinary that to remark upon it would have seemed strange. And yet, as the city carried on with its bustling days and hushed nights, a quiet transformation was underway, one measured not in grand announcements, but in the countless private moments when women reached for a dose. The Victorian woman's life, whatever her station, was often shaped by constraint at the end. For the poor, constraint came from endless labour, hunger, and the burden of children in cramped homes. For the middle classes, it came from the unending responsibilities of household management, maintaining appearances, and living within the boundaries of respectability. For the wealthy, it came from rigid social rules, expectations of poise, and the suppression of any sign of discontent. Across all of these lives, the little brown bottle offered a kind of release, and its ritual use crept quietly into the rhythm of their days. It was not uncommon in the early hours before dawn for a seamstress to sit by her window, a candle flickering low, hands cramped from work. Outside, the street might be silent, but for the distant clatter of a horse's hooves. Beside her, a glass with its bitter drops waited, a promise of rest and a dimming of pain. She did not think of herself as taking a dangerous drug. She thought only of relief, of the possibility of lying down and slipping into a softer world. In this way, one life after another found itself drawn into the same quiet reliance, invisible to most observers but shared across the city. Doctors prescribed opium as readily as they prescribed any other remedy. Well, for nervous exhaustion, for sleeplessness, for women troubled by grief or by what was often described vaguely as a female complaints, the prescription was the same. The language softened the reality. Instead of naming dependency, it spoke of nerves, fragility, delicacy. Behind those words, however, there lay countless hours of solitude in which women sipped their laudanum, waiting for the bitterness to pass and the warmth to spread. Among the respectable classes, it became almost ritualized. A lady might take her laudanum in the evening with her tea, the two blending seamlessly into one gesture of comfort. Guests might never know, for the small bottle was discreet, tucked behind silver spoons or porcelain cups. In the poorer districts, the ritual was no less meaningful. There, a mother gave her child a spoonful of syrup, watching the restless body grow still, gaining for herself a brief pause in a life of unending work. Each act, whether in grandeur or in poverty, was part of the same pattern, woven into the fabric of the city's nights. As the decades passed, the reliance deepened, yet the silence around it also grew. Newspapers seldom spoke of the scale of opium's reach into ordinary homes. Pamphlets warned occasionally of excess, but rarely of the quiet daily dependence of women who otherwise appeared perfectly respectable. The silence was sustained in part because opium was not seen as vice in the same way as other intoxicants. Gin had been condemned loudly, associated with the ruin of families and the chaos of the poor. Opium, by contrast, was considered medical, respectable, and in many cases necessary. It was, in its own way, protected by the very institutions that distributed it. The result was a kind of hidden epidemic, an epidemic without riots, without loud